poet Ghalib is one of the more interesting early examples of realism on a global scale. He is a straddler of multiple definitions. He is traditional and he is modern. He is religious and he is secular. He is Hindu and he is Muslim. He is as influenced by the culture around him as he is from what he's learning from overseas. He writes in two different languages, Persian and Urdu, and he is remarkably respected in both. This this dual identity that he has, this straddling of different cultures, this inherent liminality to his entire identity, bleeds into his work and gives it a real resonance, gives it a real personal power, but it also underscores his inherent realism because it gives his work such a sense of dislocation, of a lack of a firm foundation, because he is constantly toggling back and forth, it would seem, torn between dueling impulses that ultimately can't be resolved except by his own work. Or his work is an eternal attempt to resolve these contradictions that is ultimately fated, of course, to fail. But in that failure, the work itself gains more significance because he is struggling to resolve them. And in that struggle, you get his poetry. The realism comes in with his negotiation of these opposites. There is a real struggle to live in a tradition while at the same time being stretched by the real concerns of living in the modern day. To be a poet in many cases is to partake in living in a tradition, and traditionally poets didn't have to worry so much about making money, but he does, and this is another source of tension within his work. And you get that sense that he is consistently being ripped apart by these opposing forces in his life. One of the first ones that we have is just short lyrics for the most part. He doesn't have a lot of really longer stuff. Some of his stuff falls into a category of form called a ghazal, which he really breathes new life into. It's a traditional form that he brings it on a modern sensibility to. But a lot of these little short lyrics give very tight perspectives on his experience of the modern world. Now go and live in a place where no one lives, no one who fathoms your verse, no one who shares your speech. Build yourself a house as if without a wall or gate, no neighbor to keep you company, no watchman to keep you safe. And if you fall ill, no one to nurse you there, and if you die, no one to mourn you there. And it's hard to understand exactly where he's coming from in this. Is he being ironic? Is he saying that to live in such a place would be horrible because you would be so alone? No neighbor to keep you company, no watchman to keep you safe. This seems to be like a sense of regret, like, no, why would you want that? But at the same time, it is a kind of yearning underneath that, a yearning for release from all the attachments and the forces pulling him apart. all of those attenuations of life, of these various identities that are in constant conflict. Who wouldn't want to be released from them from time to time, just as a sense of, mere escapist break from it all? Whether or not it's permanent is another question, but he seems to be yearning simultaneously to have a vacation from his life, and also to point out that no, life is precious in a way because of all of this, because of all of the attachments you have in life to this world. No one who shares your speech significantly languages an issue with him, because it is he goes back and forth between opposing traditions of the Urdu and the Persian. Be merciful and send for me. Be merciful and send for me anytime you please. I'm not some moment that has passed and can't come back again. Why do I complain about my rival's power as though I were a weakling? My cause isn't so lost it can't be taken up again. I just can't lay my hands on poison, darling, and even if I could, I couldn't swallow it, because I've made a vow that we two shall be one again. It's a deeply personal voice, deeply vulnerable voice. The send for me. He's pleading for a lover. In this case, it's believed to be a courtesan, perhaps. But it's a physical and emotional attachment that is not idealized, but is special. It is real to him, and perhaps she is, not being as responsive as he would like. It is written in the original, from my understanding, a very formal structure, a very articulate, structured poem. And yet he can get this very personal voice into that. Another sense of opposites torn apart, something very traditional matched to something very personal and very intimate. Where's the foothold? Where's the foothold, Lord, for desire's second step? I found this barren world, this wilderness of possibilities, to be an imprint of just the first step. Where's the foothold? He's looking for a grounding. He's looking for a foundation. He's yearning for stability of some kind, along with, in here, some intimations of immortality, reincarnation, but vulnerable to this seeping, pervasive sense of rootlessness throughout. The curiosity that he has in writing these different forms and writing particular languages where every word can be remarkably fluid is he can write split versions of something. In some poems, like I've Made My Home Next Door to You, have that split identity where on the one hand he is seeming to address a lover, somebody he cares about very deeply, somebody who is of this world and very personal and intimate relationship with him. And then there is the non-secular version that is sacred, and he is talking basically to God. And I have made my home next door to you. And the multiple meanings go back and forth and shade on one another. Is the sacred so distinct from the secular? Is there a place where they can meet? And here we're back at the same yearning for cohesion that he finds throughout his work. His identity is always split in half, and he's trying trying to bring them together. And in this form, in this poem, he's able to give a sense of that without violating or cheapening either. And here's a sense of, or here's an example of his genius as a poet, that he can, that because of his facility with language, he can make each version of the same poem, or each reading of the same poem, inflect a little on the other, on the opposite. So you have to switch back and forth. You have to change your register just like he does on a daily basis. And it gives a sense of both the split between the secular and the sacred and the intertwining of it. How maybe it's not all so black and white. His series of couplets are more thoughts on vulnerability, persistent themes of insecurity within religious belief, social position, personal value, a real sense of persecution. Dear God, if there are punishments for sins committed, there also ought to be rewards for sins craved but not committed, which is almost a revoicing of the argument of Job, who is challenging God on, why am I being punished? Why am I being persecuted? Demanding an account from God, demanding some responsiveness from the divine realm that can just give him answers, or at least some recognition, some solace of his existence, or recognition of his existence, so that he doesn't feel quite so lost all the time. Just this, that it's so hard to make each task look easy, so too it isn't simple for humans to be human, which is a kind of, it isn't so easy for humans to be human, which is within a fairly philosophical poem. He is fairly abstract, addressing God and all, but bringing it back down to the human level, bringing it down to essentially a humanist concern, that realist sensibility of what tangible benefits can divinity deliver to us. It Was Essential is a very deeply personal elegy for a favorite nephew who has died, and the personal, intimate suffering that comes out is just heartbreaking. It was essential that you wait for me for a few days more. Why did you leave alone? Now wait alone for a few days more. If your gravestone hasn't worn it down for me, my head will soon be dust, for I'll be rubbing my brow upon your threshold for a few days more. You arrived yesterday, and now, today, you say, I'm leaving. I agree that staying forever isn't good, but stay with us for a few days more. As you depart, you say, we'll meet once more on Doomsday. How great that doom will have its day on one more day. Yes, oh wise and ancient sky, Arif was young. What would have gone so wrong if he hadn't died for a few more days? You were the moon of the 14th night, the full moon of my home. Why didn't that remain the picture of my household for a few more days? You weren't so uptight about the give and take of life. Couldn't death have been bribed and dissuaded from pressing his case for a few more days? Fine, you hated me and fought with Nair, But you didn't even stay to watch with pleasure your children's boisterous games for a few more days. Our time together didn't pass through every sort of circumstance to seal enduring bonds. Dead before your time, you should have passed the time with us for a few more days. Those of you around me are fools to ask, Ghalib, why are you still living? It's my destiny to continue to wish for death for a few more days. And that ending is just so powerful. The sense of death as relief. I'm just waiting for death, waiting to die. You hear this in Keats. You hear this in Whitman, most notably. You hear that recurrently in Shakespeare, that belief that life is such a burden sometimes. Life is such suffering. And here he is suffering, and he's putting it all out there. And he's just seeing that the passing of the time and that repetition, a few more days. Why couldn't he have stayed? My nephew stayed for just a few more days. Why do I have to keep suffering for just a few more days? Clearly, there's the implication that he feels like he's going to die soon. But why even drag that out? It's a sense of protesting or perhaps submitting. Submitting being the Islamic tradition. You submit to the will of God no matter what. It is my destiny to continue to wish for death. I am submitting to that, but at the same time, by just repeating it and keeping it in that context of some outrage for a few more days, driving that to tie the whole sentiment of the poem together, is a sense of protest, of anger, that this is his fate. He has to suffer this, and it's just heartbreaking. Just the humility of it, the common suffering of mankind. You weren't so uptight about the give and take of life, but couldn't death have been bribed and dissuading from pressing his case for a few more days? Just begging for some solace here. Couldn't you, death, just give me a few more days? Oh, it's just heartbreaking. My tongue begs for the power of speech. It's more uncertainty between submission or protest, indebtedness. He's begging. That is your gift to us, speech. For silence gets its style of representation from your gift to us, speech. Again, somebody who is fluent, conversant in 2 different language traditions, probably knew a few more just from reading at least, and understanding the facility of language and the subtlety of it and some of the inherent problems of it. Joys come mediated with the threat of sorrow in the pre-dawn hours, concupiscence, the contrivance of effects that follow later, the flood of tears, the colors of grief, are all your gifts to us, addressing God and just the good and the bad. Garden after garden multiplies the mirrors that fill desire's lap. The hope that flowers there, immersed in the spring displays, is your gift to us. Devotion is the veil that keeps our hubris hidden, held in check. The brow that scrapes the ground, the prayer mat, are your gifts to us. The brow that scrapes the ground, that sounds resentful to God. our farce-like search for mercy, our secretive retreat behind a festival's facade, the firmness of our courage, the sorrow at tests we fail, are all your gifts to us. A sod in the season of roses, in an arbor that enchants us with its overarching latticework, the winding walk, the bracing easterly, the flower bed in bloom, are all your gifts to us. Nature offers beauty, but at what cost? The anger, the pain exists. It's undeniable. It's ineradicable. As a human limited being, you can't do anything about it. Yet it burns against an impenetrable God, and there is a sense of defiance in that. Maybe it's my reading, maybe an Islamic scholar reading this would probably see it very differently, but I read a resistance to such submission on the basis of human grounds, that as a human being, Ghalib demands more recognition than simply being so vulnerable to gods and fate. One of his most significant pieces is Petition My Salary, where you see a really practical discussion of tradition versus the moderning world. Moderning, is that a word? I'm not even sure. But it is an address to the emperor, who was both his student, Ghalib was a teacher, and his employer. So there's a sense of divided identities right there. And it is a conflict between that traditional culture that has a very regular pay schedule of once every 6 months. And this, from Ghalib's perspective, is insufficient for the modern world. He's not asking for more money necessarily. He's just asking that the payment be regularized, that he be paid on a more frequent basis, so that he can cover his bills. Because he's talking about how if you're paid in every 6 months, you feel really good for the first month, and then after that you're getting more and more anxious, and by the end of that 6-month period you're probably not eating much at all. My master and my pupil, my salary agreed upon is paid to me in the strangest way. The custom is to consecrate the dead once in 6 months. That's the basis on which the world runs. But if you look at me, look at the reality of me, you'll see that I am a prisoner of life, not death, and 6 monthly paydays fall only twice a year. All I do each month is take out a debt with wrangles over interest repeated endlessly. My moneylender has become a partner in 1/3 of my earnings. Today the world has no one like me, a poet of worth who speaks beautifully. If you wish to hear an epic of war, my tongue's a sharp sword. If you convene an assembly, my pen's a cloud that rains down pearls. It's a violation of etiquette not to praise poetry. It's an act of violence not to love me. I'm your slave, and I wander naked. I'm your servant, and all I eat is debt. Let my salary be paid month by month. Let my life cease to be a burden. And now I conclude my discourse of prayer and supplication. My business isn't poetry. May you live safe and sound for 1,000 years. May the days in every year be 50,000. Now that last phrase, may you live safe and sound for 1,000 years. May the days in your every year be 50,000. gets repeated an awful lot in the Islamic tradition as a kind of honorific sign-off. Essentially, it's like writing sincerely at the end of a letter. It's a gratuitous overabundance of praise for someone, essentially. Oh, you're the greatest. Sincerity, perhaps not. But the way it works within the poem is sort of interesting, because he is asking to be released from this traditional pay scale, this traditional pay schedule. And this is clearly a problem for him, and he's having to take out loans, and he lays all that out very prosaically. This is a poem, which is a traditional type of thing, and the poem is supposed to be about fairly traditional stuff, but it's a poem about a pay schedule, which is inherently very mundane, not the stuff poetry is written about. And he defends his vocation as a poet in this, saying, my pen's a cloud that rains down pearls, my tongue is a sharp sword to compose an epic of war. He's demanding that recognition for it, and he's making the poem about poetry as much as it is about payments, which is an interesting little convolution, because again, poetry is supposed to be very traditional in this in this world, where it is supposed to be something that has set forms, set structures, established modes of speaking, and he is mixing it all together, and he is demanding the right to do so. And then at the end, he comes, after defending it as this great identity of his and this great dignity of this tradition, he tosses in that little phrase: may you live safe and sound for 1,000 years, may your days in every year be 50,000, which is hyperbole, certainly. It is a kind of stock answer. It is very much also, let's face it, a lie. He can't live that long. Nobody can. So in this poem about the wonder and the value of poetry, he ends it with a few lines that are in fact a lie. Is poetry all a lie? Is the mission of the poet inherently fraudulent? Is it his job to lie to the emperor? The mechanics of the poetry itself seem in conflict with one another. You're not quite sure. Is this a poem about poetry, which there's a long tradition of that? Is this a poem about more realistic, mundane stuff? There's less of a tradition of that. But what he's doing at this juncture in the middle of the 1800s is capturing this essential conflict and saying that, okay, the ideal, the tradition, doesn't necessarily fit reality today. Reality today demands we look at it with some perspective and some honesty. And reality means money. Realism is largely about or driven by concerns of money. Economics are all over it because the wealth distribution was becoming a little bit more frustrated at the same time that we were getting a middle class rise, demanding more of a share of social and cultural respect. And there are all these tensions getting swapped back and forth, and he finds himself in the middle of all of this. As a tutor to the emperor, that sounds like a cushy gig, but he's still in debt. All he eats is debt. He points that out again and again. He has no steady foundation on which to live. He is forced to create his own life on a day-to-day basis, his own ability to live on a day-to-day basis. And this is the fundamental question of realism. He can't have faith that God and fate is just going to take care of him, because God and fate can be awfully cruel, it would seem. He needs to take a cold, hard look at the life he has and the support he has and understand it, and maybe try and make it better. But the only way to make it better, he knows, is to not lie to yourself anymore, and to point out what a lie is, and to know the difference between lies and truth. In this, he brings the confluence that is at once always ripping him apart, but always also meeting in him. The differences between the ideal and the personal, the public and the intimate, the traditional and the modern, the sacred and the secular. All of this is converging and splitting off from his identity. He makes realism very personal. As it's starting to flower around the globe, he gives it a voice that is deeply, deeply individualistic and intimate, and at the same time reflects all of the characteristics of a worldwide and epic-defining aesthetic movement.